Hello, I've got this Ace of Pentacles. It's a piece from my Verdance Tarot, which is a long-term work in progress. I'm going to be showing you a time-lapse of the painting process going through the making of this piece. In one of my earlier videos, I do show the sketch process and the early brainstorming of the elements for this painting. But here I'm going to be doing the watercolor process. So initially, what I've got going on here is a lot of washes, very loose, very pale colored. This is just to set the tone for some of those areas, including the coin in the upper area. And I decided that I also wanted to do some gold leaf down at the bottom here. Now this is imitation gold leaf, which means that it is actually copper, even though it's called gold leaf when you purchase it at the art stores. And I am using it with Daniel Smith clear watercolor ground as my adhesive to get it to just stick to my page. It's not generally used as an adhesive, it's actually used as a watercolor painting surface, but I like to use it for this because it, one, serves the purpose of adhering the gold leaf to my paper, but two, also means that I can now paint on top of it because I have this layer of watercolor ground, and to further allow me to paint even more onto that surface because the watercolor ground kind of pulls away from the edges of the metal. So I need to paint a few layers in order to get enough of it to stick. So there's a little bit more white watercolor ground there as well that I just added. Now, while that is drying, I decided to go back in onto the coin and start painting. I'm working using glazes to slowly build up the colors and have a depth and complexity to my color tones as these multiple layers are drying on top of each other, and you get to see various bits and pieces of the layers as I go. Shifting to smaller brushes. You see I started off at the very beginning with large flat or filbert brushes to brush in just the large wash areas, but at this point now I'm shifting down to number 2 rounds and number 0 rounds occasionally as well. But this is what I use for once I get started on the detail aspects of the piece. So here I'm just continuing lots and lots of layers of glazes. It takes uncounted numbers of layers to build up the complexity of the shading and tones that I do in my paintings. And because watercolor dries very quickly, though, it doesn't feel like it is as many layers as it ultimately is, because I just keep going. I just keep moving around the piece, adding more glazes over areas as they dry, and as the part that I'm working on is wet, I just move away from that, move on to other aspects. For this bee coin symbol, I actually used an ancient Egyptian icon of the bee goddess, and I did a little bit of modification to it to give it more of an Art Nouveau sweep to the lines and refining it as well. And I decided to use that as the centerpiece for my Ace of Pentacles, and indeed for the whole Pentacles suit has a bee theme going on with it, bees and honeycombs and the richness that the honey represents. Painting this coin, I'm using shades of yellow and gold and orange, but I'm also using some purpley bits, some brown, a little bit of green to give it that little bit of patina look to it as well. The brown is mostly going into these deep line crevices of the icon of the bee and of the carving edge around the coin as well. But I'm also using some purple to shade that to give it even more darkness and some more richness to it. Here in particular, you can see me using a little bit more purple and green tones and doing some more purple washes around the perimeter area to kind of darken that and make the coin pop out more, because I want the light tones of the coin itself to really be evident. Now I'm starting on the roots, and I'm painting in the negative space of those roots with a purpley tone. And I kind of go back and forth between that and the coin because I want to see the contrast in action as I'm working. So, as I'm doing the edges of the coin, I feel the need for those edges to really pop out more. And so I start to move, drifting outwards into the surrounding root areas. And that kind of keeps me grounded and keeps it so that the coin itself is integrated into the surroundings. And this goes for any foreground element. Whenever I'm working on a foreground element, I start to creep out along the edges of it as I paint it, as I start to come closer to finishing that foreground focal point, because I don't want to just complete the foreground thing by itself and just have it floating in a void. I want it to really interact and to be embedded in and be a part of the surroundings. And to do that, at least for me, I have to kind of do it simultaneously. I have to kind of have this outward melting of my foreground focal thing into the surrounding stuff. And in this case, it's the roots, and it is literally embedded into the roots. So I really want to have that kind of visceral sense even as I'm working, as I'm painting. I feel it in my body. As I've mentioned before, a lot of times when I'm painting, I actually feel a physicality to the painting. I feel the movement and the flow in my actual body itself. It's a strange thing to describe to people sometimes. Okay, here we go now into the more general background area. I knew from the start that I wanted to have a green theme to this piece. I didn't know what my specific colors were going to be. I knew that the coin was going to be golden, and I knew that the honeycomb was going to have some golden overtures to it as well. But overall, I needed to somehow weave that in with green, because that is the color theme that I have decided on for my Pentacles / coin suit. Each of my suits have their own color theme, and that kind of helps them to cohere together, to give them a link, a visual link, so that anyone who looks at a card can instantly tell which suit to which it belongs before you even start to look at what is actually depicted in the piece. And I like that sort of subtle cue that lets people know what's going on. So anyway, I started off with those general large washes in those areas to kind of set the tone for everything, and then I start working on the specifics. I start going into those roots some more because I had already started branching out from the center. I like to have some point of contact where I'm just referring to what is already completed and moving out from that in this expanding elaboration of detail. And so these roots now, I'm using this kind of greenish gold tone to do the negative space of their forms and their shapes. And I've talked about this before in other walkthroughs and in some of my written walkthroughs, as well as the video ones, of how I do tree branches and tree roots, where I start with the large form negative space shapes of them, and then in successive layers of washes, I slowly start to push the color tones deeper and darker and physically deeper into what I am depicting. So, as I'm painting, these are the roots that are more buried deep into the tangle rather than the surface ones. And as I'm doing that, I'm also kind of pulling out finer and smaller little roots and tangles. And so this gives the whole thing a sort of fractal development where you kind of get sucked in. The more you look at it, the deeper it goes and the more detailed it becomes. You know, I'm starting to also do these little hexagons, which are the honeycomb in the lower area. Just as I was working, when I was working on the coin, how I sort of expanded out from that as I was nearing completion with it. So I'm doing with the roots here as I'm painting the roots, and they are sort of starting to come into their own being. I sort of expand the areas that I'm working on, and so I sort of go out and down into that honeycomb area, and I'm going to be moving up into the sky area as well as I progress in that direction. Getting those deeper tones in kind of gives me the ideas for how I want to treat the surface colors, what I want those to be, and also how I want to have some more contrast in the upper area from the lower so that I don't have everything all in this uniform gold green tone. I want to have a little bit more variety. I want the upper area above the surface of the roots and ground to have a little bit of something to grab your eye and to grab your attention. I'm using a white gel pen here to do some final surface highlights on some of that root tangle to give it a little bit of something to pull it out from the darkness that's surrounding. And you know, I mostly painted around the white areas, around the light areas in a traditional watercolor way, but I do like a little bit of the punch that the white gel pen harsh edges provide. And now working on the other side of the piece, same kind of progression, working from the larger negative space areas and progressively working smaller and smaller. And you can see I also start working with smaller and smaller brushes as I work that progression. You'll also notice that I have the piece upside down here. I always turn my pieces every which way as I paint, you know, whichever direction is easiest to access the areas that you're working on. Sometimes it has to do with how the natural flow of the lines work, because it feels easier for me to do these vertical strokes versus horizontal. So I'll rotate things in order to provide more of that vertical stroke area for me to do. But also sometimes it has to do with just letting one side of the painting dry, and you just don't want to disturb that. So you flip it around and you can work on the other side, and you don't have to worry about messing up the areas that you have recently painted. I paint flat on my desk. I don't work on an easel, and that's what makes this constant rotation possible as well, because I am working flat. All right, here we go for some more of that upper area as well as the lower areas, because I focused my initial attention on this middle strip of the painting, and now I have this sky and the lower foreground stuff to work on. Working on these hills as well, painting in some large washes of green for that, as well as the olive tree, or what will eventually be the olive tree. At this point, it is just a green blob. And you can see as the lower stuff dries what it looks like. That was done with Indian ink, Winsor Newton Indian ink. And I just let the ink granulate and create lots of great, wonderful textures for myself. Now, those last two phases that you saw, especially the Indian ink, actually took quite some time to dry. I usually try to time things so that I work on areas like that at the end of a painting session. So I'll do it right before I decide to quit for the day. In the case of this piece, it did actually happen to be fairly late. I was really sucked into working on it, and so it wasn't until midnight I decided, okay, let's pour this ink on and let that sit and dry so that next morning when I come, when I come down to my desk to start working, I could just do it without having to worry about this thing that's going to take hours and hours to set. And that then, sometimes you can't plan your schedule quite so that it works out like that, but sometimes it does work. So in this case it did. Other times I'll actually pick up a separate painting to work on if I have some large inky area that I need to allow to dry. But in this case, things worked out. But anyway, here we go on the upper area. I really wanted to have this very twisted, gnarled, old olive tree. I had just seen a photo someone posted of how gorgeous some of these ancient trees in Greece look. And I felt that the olive tree was a good symbolic tree for my Pentacles suit. Lots of broad washes and then dotting in some mica pigment up there to give it a little bit of glittery bloom. And working on these hills on the side as well, these rocky outcroppings, alternating between dry brushing the fine little details of them and then doing a flat brush to swipe across and smooth out and blend things a little bit and maybe add a little bit of white watercolor, or sorry, not white watercolor, but white gel pen as well for a few highlights in there. And the final weaving of these branches and roots into those hilly areas, because just like with the coin, I don't want everything to be kind of having this cut and paste feel of being on top of each other. I want them all to be integrated and tangled up in each other so that they all coexist within this space rather than being just one that's overlapped on another as if you cut it out of a magazine and pasted it on there. And to accomplish that, I feel like there has to be a lot of back and forth within various elements going from your foreground to the background and then moving out again. Now here I've got a little bit of white watercolor ground to add some brightness to that negative space around the tree area. This kind of adds just this nice liveliness to the sky. I always love how white as negative space looks when painted around foresty tree elements. Finally getting to this honeycomb, and I'm just using some browns and golds and greens to paint in each of these little hexagons. And then I'm going to go back in after that and do some more contouring and shading of them. But initially I just wanted to get their forms in, blocked in like that. And then continuing with the branches, or the roots, I suppose is what it is down here. Continuing with these roots and finally really integrating them with the honeycomb area. If you'll recall, in the early stages, I did some copper leaf in these lower parts of the painting, and I had some of it splashing out into the honeycomb area, and I really like now how those tiny little bits of gold gleam through here and there throughout the honeycomb, as well as more intensely in the corners where I had the most of the copper leaf focused and without any watercolor ground over it, so that you really see the flat gold of it shining there. And the treatment of the roots down in this lower area is pretty similar to what I did in the upper branches. Now I'm taking some white watercolor ground and using that to just paint a base area for use to paint on these flowers and the little larval bees that are tucked into these honeycombs. Rather than trying to paint around and leave the white of the paper earlier, I made the decision that I was just going to use the white watercolor ground at a late stage to give myself a white base again. And as a final touch in the upper parts of the painting, I decided that I needed a little bit more liveliness, so I added these little specks of orange flowers dotting the hillsides. I hope you enjoyed watching the process of this painting. I don't often do a video of larger pieces like this. Thank you to all you Patreon subscribers, and if there is a subject you'd like to see me address or work on in the future, please feel free to drop me a line.